Hello, how is everyone? I can't hear you, so you can't answer that question. I'm Scott Stoll, that's my dog Karma, making a cameo appearance there. And we are about to have another great episode of the Flutter Apprentice Book Club. So in order to help with that, and I do need some help, here's Danielle.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, Danielle.
Might be wondering what's up with Simon, why he's not here. This is normally you and he up at this point of the day.
I'll tell you what.
Uh-oh.
I'm having some interesting technical difficulties with my
issue.
sound, so I'm going to let you take over.
So Scott can't hear us there, and so that's interesting. So he's going to have to be fixing that. And anyway, why are we here today? Yay, we're here for the Flutter Apprentice Book Club. Welcome, everybody. And this one's going to be on data persistence, which is chapters 9 and part of 15. And let's start bringing up our other people that are going to be joining me. Can we have Esra come to the stage?
Hello, everybody. Esra here, and we are here to help you stay motivated and reading through the end of the book with the data persistence episode today. So we have do's and the don'ts. You want to continue, Danielle?
That's perfect. Absolutely. Okay. So as we know, this is on YouTube and it's the internet, and I hate the fact that we even have to do this, but we have a few rules that we want to go over. So we need you to be nice and respectable and constructive while you're interacting in the chat or social media or basically anywhere. And what do we by that mean? We mean that you should not post anything if it's adult, if it's rude, or if it's offensive. And also don't advertise and promote stuff right now. This is for all of us learning, and we've got our stuff that we're doing here. We want you to not spam, which is if you keep posting the question over and over and over, it's a lot less likely that we're going to try to answer that question. We see them, we take a look at them, and we will get to the ones that we can with it. And all of your questions are important to us. And then finally, and this is the part that I hate, is that harassment of any kind is not tolerated at this event, and we'll kick you off from that. And the one thing I want to say is that we're a friendly community, but we all talk to each other. So you just be nice. That's what we're asking you to do. And anyway, so that's our do's and don'ts, and follow those, and we'll be good. Now I've got a few people I'd like to introduce. I'd like to bring Stef up on stage. She's one of our co-organizers of the Flutteristas, and more importantly, she is our representative here. She was the tech editor on this book that we're going through, and she's here representing Ray Wenderlich, or at least one of the representatives.
Hi.
And, hi.
And we have Kevin Moore with us today. Kevin is the author for chapters 9 and 15. So thank you so much for joining us, Kevin. We're excited to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
That's great. Okay, and then we've got Scott, who you already saw at the beginning real quick. And he'll be back later talking to us about some stuff. Or I guess he's coming back now, or not. And we also have Simon, who will hopefully be joining us for the Q&A if he's able to. But as of right now, he's not here. And so these are our people we've got ready to go with this. Now, a few other people I kind of want to introduce is Randall. We have Randall. He's our question moderator, I guess is the official title. He's a GDE. So if you ask a question, he's quite likely going to be the one that's answering you in chat. And we'll try to do it online, but he's the one that jumps in there. We have Sarah, Sarah's going to be coming on, I think, in a second to help us out. She's the Flutter Community Program Manager. She is she's helping Nilay out with a lot of stuff, if you know who Nilay is. So she's doing a lot of this kind of stuff for us, and she's the one that's the driving force behind us having the club. And then we've got Craig, and Craig's going to be on in a little bit, and he's the one that is doing the sessions to help us learn here. And he is a developer relations engineer there at Google, and we're very lucky to have him help guide us through the code. And all right, that's great. What if people have questions, what should they do?
to help us find your questions, when you're putting your questions to the YouTube chat, please do not forget to put Q in front of it so that we can find them easily. So here we are, we have the explanation also. So thank you everybody, and we will read them all as possible. So be sure that we are taking care of it.
That's great. Okay, well, I think that's probably enough of us jabbering, or mainly me jabbering, I guess. And let's go ahead and Craig, I think the show's all yours. Wrong button, I think, actually there. We're doing some stuff behind the scenes. Sorry about that. All right, let's go ahead and start with the presentation.
All right, everyone, welcome back. It is week 5, chapter 9 and 15. And we are live again on the Flutter Apprentice Book Club. My name is still Greg Labenz, and I am excited to talk about shared preferences and persisting data. Everything that we've done so far within the app has been lost the second we've done a full hot restart, or certainly if we've returned at a later date to continue development. All progress within the app, any data, any recipes that you've saved in the Fooderlich app, any astronomy pictures that we didn't even have liking capacity. Well, we had a journal. Any journal entries that we wrote, gone. So I am pretty excited to start to persist some data. Okay, so let's waste no more time. This slide, pretty exciting this week. We're going to talk about persisting data. It's about really all they do in chapter 9, and then we're going to do it. So, all right. Why you know advance? There we go. Next slide. All right. So we all know the problem because we've been developing our app, and we've seen that you take some action. We'll just say you're liking an object, or you're favoriting something, and it's just us in development right now. So you eventually do some sort of complete, non-stateful hot restart, and the data didn't stick. It's not favorited anymore. You don't have it. It wasn't real. And that's not very fun, and it really makes your app not feel alive. So what we need is something that survives from one run of our app, one launch of our app to the next. And so for that, we're going to have to use the file system. And that'll be, in a mobile app, you actually use the phone's file system. In a browser, you use the browser's local storage. And which underneath the hood eventually is going to use the file system. And there's no kind of way around that. So we need something to store structured data, ideally. Not just the file system. We want it to be a little bit smarter than that. This is a universal symbol for a database for anyone unsure. So this is persistent data that we've got going on here. And we need something that's going to store the actions that people have taken. So if you've liked ID 2 there, or index 2, I guess it would be like ID 3, but it's index 2. Maybe I should have written 3. Anyway, one of the records in your app gets liked or favorited by a user. You just need something that holds on to that data so that when you restart everything again, it stays, that state persists. And that means then that your app on launch needs to check where it writes data as well. And we're going to do all that in the shared preferences section. As usual, if you read chapter 9 and have already done the homework, then you know how this story goes. If not, no problem. You'll be able to catch up. Okay, so we're already to a code. It's not really an interlude anymore, is it? It's just like the code, because this is the last phase. So let's move over. Oh no, I had those black bars there. Stinky. So first thing I want to talk about is the restructuring that I've done of our app. We had talked in previous weeks about how it's whatever your folder structure is, it's just important to be consistent and stick with it. And every time we said that, I thought to myself, oh, we're not really doing that in the APOD app now, are we? There were a couple different ideas that we had from week to week and weren't very consistent. So I just tidied up a few things here, and we now have this API folder. This is actually pretty old. Honestly, this could maybe even still go into like features shared, now that I'm thinking about it a little more. Navigation maybe could also go into features shared, because everything uses navigation, and at least a couple of things are going to use the API. But within features, I've tidied up a lot. We are now focused entirely on what pages we have, and there really are only a couple pages. So we have our home page, and the home page, each of these tabs had their own page widget, and that was the core of what kind of felt a little weird to me. So I just put all of those things into their own tabs files. We've got barrel files everywhere. So tabs.dart, no, of course, can't load. Anyway, tabs.dart, it's just a barrel file, so it's just exporting everything there. And it's actually exporting other barrel files, which is pretty fun. So in all of these, we just have more, we have all of our old code for each of these features consolidated. And what used to be called, for example, favorite APODs page, I renamed that to favorites APOD tab because it's really more of a tab, not so much of a page. And that's that. So we are now ready to get into shared preferences stuff. So let's do a little git checkout. Chapter 9, step 1, add favorites manager. And if we look at this, so our favorites manager, by the way, just thinking about what we were going to store in shared preferences for the APOD app, in the book in chapter 9, it starts to get into groceries and, what meals you're going to make and whatnot. And there's a search bit of functionality as well. And you can just search for grocery, you can search for recipes, which is what they do in the Fooderlich app, because you can imagine just being like, I want to eat something with, I don't know, onions. And you search onions and some food comes up and you make it. But with all of outer space, it's like, how would you search for some stars? You're going to search like, red giant. I'm like, why do you care about red giant so much? So we're not going to do in search. We also don't have a way to look up stars yet. But we needed something to put into shared preferences. So what we are ultimately going to do is actually finally wire up our favorites. So we're going to be able to tag each picture of the day as a favorite of ours personally, and then our favorites tab is going to work. Before, if you recall, it was just loading a set of predefined pictures of the day from a dedicated favorites APOD JSON file. And that's not going to do anymore as our app becomes more interactive. So, okay, so we have a favorites manager. And the first thing that you'll see here is that, we're going to add it to our provider setup. And then that, of course, means it's now time to look at our favorites manager. And this is, we're also going to get our first hints of thinking about a little bit more state management stuff here, because you can't have a favorites list without pointing your brain at the problem of state management. And we're still just using a change notifier, like very simple, viable, but very simple solution. But we're going to be thinking about that through the rest of chapter 9 and chapter 15. But our favorites manager is very focused, and it just maintains a set of IDs of which items have been favorited. And I was thinking about the different functionality that we have, and you really just need to be able to toggle, for example, right? Because you're going to have a we're going to be able to click this, and you're going to have a heart icon that's going to flip back and forth. Haven't even wired it up yet, but we're going to need to be able to toggle favorites. And then we need to know, of course, if a given thing is favorited. So I have an add favorite and a remove favorite method, and they right now are private because I can't figure out a reason to expose them. We just need to expose is favorited and toggle favorite. So this is our our favorites manager. Sorry, it's change notifier, calls notify listeners in any writing method. Obviously doesn't have to in reading methods. Change notifier, favorites manager, pretty straightforward there. Now in our APOD card, there's a few things that are happening. We start to pull in this new manager. So where does that happen? Oh yes, down in our gesture detector here. I think I'm going to need to rebuild because we can see here that we are drawing a favorite icon, and yet we see it not. Let's rebuild. But anyway, we have, let's go back. I want to see the heart icon. There we go. Okay, so we have we're using context.read, and that again is coming from the provider package, and it's able to look up our widget tree until it finds some sort of provider that is giving us the favorites manager. So it eventually works its way all the way back up to the very root of our app, and it finds this favorites manager change notifier. And then we use that to see whether or not the actually up here this is where we wire up our untoggle. Sorry, so this is the click handler for the heart. And this is what's going to make this actually behave the way we expect when I click it in a second. And then separately, we need to be able to draw the heart correctly. And for that, we're using the consumer widget, which again goes and finds the same favorites manager. But I'm doing this slightly differently because this is about to trigger rebuilds. Right? Remember, every time you call notify listeners, anything that has subscribed as a listener is notified, and in the way when that's a widget getting notified, it rebuilds itself. But I don't want to rebuild the whole app, certainly, when just one card changes. I don't even really want to rebuild the whole card. Only the heart changes. And so we've scoped our favorites manager listening behavior to as tight of a window as possible. And the only thing that is under the influence of this favorites manager relationship is our icon. And if the favorites manager thinks that we're favorited, then we draw a red heart. Otherwise, we draw a white heart. Pretty straightforward. So we can start to click things, and they are favorited. And we see that that is happening, just kind of going back here now that we've actually triggered this interactivity. When we call toggle favorite, we see whether or not it is or not. We add it or remove it. And this is just populating our set, keeping all of the IDs in order. And then we call notify listeners. So that is step one, where we've added this favorites manager. We're of course not persisting anything yet, but this is kind of the trajectory that they take in the book. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to step two, because our favorites tab is still hard-coded to use that JSON file. And it's time to update that. So let's do git checkout chapter 9, step 2, updates favorite tab. Update favorites tab. Okay, so let's hop over to that file, favorites tab. And we see here that, again, a couple of things have changed. We're using our mock service for a little bit longer, and this is a disappointing reality. Anytime that you've got some data loading happening in a widget build method and you're initializing classes that do this, whoo, that's really scary stuff. But we've just been punting on that layer of our functionality for quite a while, and we're going to do so for just a little bit more. We're also watching this favorites manager. This didn't used to have to watch anything because it just read from the hard-coded file it got the favorites by initializing this service and loading the favorites apod JSON file. But now we have a manager, so things are going to be a little bit different. The reason we have the service in here for now, just for a little bit longer, is that the service is still our only source of what all the astronomy pictures of the day even are. So we need to load, we've got our service here, and we've restructured the get favorite apods method to take some IDs, but then it returns a list of astronomy pictures of the day by just comparing what it got out of that file, the main file with all the astronomy pictures of the day, against our list of IDs that we pass in. So we're going to start using our manager a little bit, but we haven't totally separated ourselves from this fake data service, but that's coming. So then I think everything else here is the same, but I wanted to highlight that getting to use our favorites manager, if I rebuild here, and of course we're not yet using shared preferences, so the fact that I have clicked any of these hearts won't yet persist. But I'll click them again, because I'm flexible like that. And we hop over to favorites, and now we see just the one that we clicked. And if we go back to recent and we unclick it, we've got an empty state and says, hey, you ain't got no favorites yet. So this is cool. We're getting more cross-screen functionality. Oh, I missed the heart, an inaccurate click. We're getting cross-screen functionality, and it's coming by way of, again, thinking a little bit more about state management in a holistic way. Okay, so now it's time to start persisting stuff. So I'm going to do a git checkout chapter 9. Oh, we're on 2, so 3. Add shared preferences. Look at that. Okay. It's, oh right, it's downloading the shared preferences file because, or not file, package. Because shared preferences now appears in pubspec.yaml. And again, if you've read chapter 9, you're familiar with what the heck shared preferences is. It wraps local storage options on all target platforms. So on Android, it wraps the API that's named shared preferences. On iOS, it wraps something called user defaults. Honestly, I think all of these names are like okay at best. And then in web, it wraps local storage. That's actually the best name, in my opinion, of all of these. That one actually uses words that describe what it does. But that is now downloaded and available to us. So let's start to think about how we can make this work. And favorites manager isn't spelled even close to like that, is, I think, a reasonable place to start putting this functionality. Now, we don't want to just initialize shared preferences, in our widget tree. They do that in chapter 9, and that I think is because they're trying to go slowly with these other concepts. But I'm here to take us to the next level on this recap of chapter 9. So I don't want us to initialize shared preferences in our widget tree. Imagine writing tests for those widgets, and now all of a sudden they're trying to initialize shared preferences. That's going to try to call Android API calls or iOS API calls, but neither of those exist when you're just running the unit tests. So that's a little sticky. And even initializing it in the favorites manager starts to mean, can I even use my favorites manager unless I have an actual Android or iOS runtime? I, again, want to be able to write tests for my favorite manager one day, and I don't want to be dependent on those things for my test to run. So we're just setting ourselves up here by saying, let's pass something that resembles shared preferences into our favorites manager. And for now, it is just the full shared preferences object. This comes from main.dart, by the way. We see here we declare a variable named shared preferences, and then we initialize it in our main method. Remember, this is the place where you just kind of do some bootstrapping things to get your app ready to run. By the time you need, if you do need platform-specific things, by the way, expect to need this widgets Flutter binding ensure initialized call. That makes sure that Flutter and the Flutter engine are fully running and ready to go and communicating with each other. And that's required anytime you want to make platform-specific calls. So we have to make this call before we can get shared preferences ready. But then shared preferences will be ready. And ultimately now our favorites manager will accept this shared preferences object. So that's pretty cool. And then our, let's close some of these files, by the way. We don't need you anymore. Our favorites manager now has this new method, sync to persistence. And this is going to allow things to actually survive the relaunch of our app, which is really exciting. And what sync to persistence does, because what we're doing right now is operating on a list of strings, or sorry, a list of integers, these IDs for all of the pictures of the day. And that starts to be a little awkward when you're using a very kind of bare bones storage API like shared preferences, because shared preferences targets kind of simple data. No offense to shared preferences. That's its stated goal. So you wouldn't want to use shared preferences as a place where you put your entire database, for example. That you would quickly outgrow it. You'd have no elbow room to kind of stretch your data storage, have it get comfortable. So we're storing a list of integers in this kind of primitive data storage thing. What's the word? Library, solution, one of those things. And so I just made a decision. Let's convert our list of integers into a single string. And we're going to make it a comma separated string. Now this is not a great idea, and we won't keep it for long, but it's our first stab at it. So our sync to persistence method already knows all of the IDs, by the way. Here it is, this favorite IDs variable. So it already knows that, and we're just going to map, by the way, if you're new to Dart, is a method that loops over something and changes each entry in the original list to some new other thing as it goes. And then it returns a list with each element having undergone the transformation. You can sometimes change the type, you don't have to. So we are changing the type here, and we're saying our outbound list is going to be a list of strings instead of a list of integers. But each pass through the list, that's this method here, we still are getting those old integers, and then all we do is convert them to a string. So now we have, at this point, a list of strings. The highlighted code is giving us a list of strings. And the last part here, join, if you're familiar with programming at all, then you know join takes a list and turns it all into a string with each element separated by what is in your join, what you pass to your join method. So this gives us all of our IDs smushed together as one big string separated by commas. And then we can store those IDs as a string into shared preferences. Now, that was a bit of juggling. It was pretty convoluted, I admit. But it allows us to have this read from persistence method. And read from persistence is going to just do this in reverse order. So it goes to shared preferences, it gets our string back, and this is again IDs as a string. And if we haven't done anything yet, we'll have to check for that, because the first time through the user won't have favorited anything. So we might have gotten no answer. If so, that's fine. But if we did get something, we're going to add to our favorites ID, which is already instantiated, by the way, or set. It's not an ID. It's several IDs. We're going to add to that set, and we're going to call map again. So we've got our IDs as a string split on that comma. That's the opposite of join. So it's going to loop over the string, find every comma that it sees along the way, just takes a cleaver and chops the string in half. Chop, 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 chop. Now we have an array of strings. The commas are gone. And we call map again, and now we're turning them back into integers. So then we have an inner function right here that it receives all of those strings, and we just convert them to integers. That's what int.parse does. And that gives us an iterable, which is normally thought of as a list. So we just convert it into a set, because a set is what we are using. So this all gives us a set of integers, and then we add them to what we are using to actually draw our UI. And if I rebuild now, I don't think I've rebuilt yet. I think I needed to do this. Apologies, I didn't. Oh, it's taken a second, isn't it? What's happening? Oh, it's locked up completely. We need to do a full restart because we have added a start debugging. Really should have done this earlier. Well, this will be a great time to talk about what happens when you add a dependency that, well, actually, this is kind of true for any dependency, and it is definitely true if you add a dependency that calls into native APIs. Certainly a hot reload, straight out. A hot restart, also totally out. And you'll basically have to completely rebuild your app because those calls that shared preferences, the Dart library makes into whatever the native runtime is, those need to be registered at boot. That's the only time that it can happen. And so your window to do that has already elapsed. So we start over, no harm, no foul, really. Builds pretty quick. We're here. We're going to press this heart. Our favorites tab shows two things. That was unexpected. Why does it show? Oh, this one's hearted as well. Oh, you know what's happening? I already had shared preferences because I've already written this code. And so shared preferences, the library, is finding the old storage that I have on the file system. Very funny. Well, it persists, folks. But we'll save a couple and then we'll prove to ourselves that it's still working. So I have 3, I've just clicked these exact 3, and I'm going to do not a hot reload, which is the lightning bolt, but a full hot restart. And this would normally wipe away anything that we've done, but we are calling read from persistence. And now when we go to favorites, we will see the same 3 pictures favorited. Okay. I think I have one more step. Pretty sure. My notes suggest. Git checkout chapter 9, step 4, refactor shared preferences. Now, that previous factor didn't live very long. We're already refactoring it. And we talked about how having shared preferences as a dependency of our favorites manager was a little awkward because it would be very challenging to write tests around our favorites manager when the test environment doesn't have any of those implementations for the functions that we need. So how do we do this better? First of all, we've got a new class that shows up in our favorites manager definition, and it's called persistence. Okay, let's give that a peek. And persistence is just a thing that we've made up. You can call it whatever we want. And it has 2 methods, and these are very focused on our needs for our app. And so we say we've got a set key and a get key, because that's all we're doing right now. So this persistence class is abstract, and this is going to allow us in tests to create a fake or a mock version of this persistence class and pass that into our widgets. But in the real world, we do actually want to use shared preferences. So here we make a version of persistence, and we call it shared preferences persistence. And because it needs to actually use the shared preferences library, it will be what accepts that shared preferences object that we were using before. And it, of course, has to actually supply a set and get key, and it will just call shared preferences, exactly like we were doing before. So this takes very simple, keys and values, depending on which method it is. And then back in our favorites manager, we see that we're now just using, instead of shared preferences.setString and shared preferences.readString or getString or whatever it was, we're now using our class, and now our favorites manager has less of an idea about how this actually gets realized, but it's up to the persistence class to know, hey, where does this data go? Where does it come from? I sang that song in the previous week. I'm not going to do it again. Okay, so this refactor is going to start a conversation that will continue as we go through chapter 15 about starting to pay closer attention to who knows what. But stay tuned for that in chapter 15 coming up shortly. First, we've got some Q&A. I'm ready to pass it back. Folks, who's ready?
All right. And Esra needs to come back on screen with me too, if she's there.
Yes, thank you, Craig, for this great presentation.
All right, I'm having issues hearing Esra, but it could be me.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, so okay. We are inviting Sarah here to talk about community resources. Hello Sarah,
again.
how are you?
Hi. Well, first of all, thanks, Craig. That was awesome. But you might have some questions about the content. So I am here to tell you about some places where you can get help. So community resources. So first of all, there is the Flutter Community Network, which has over 100 meetups all over the world, and they are full of people that are just really happy to help. And you can go and join one if there's one near you, or even if there isn't one near you. A lot of them do online events now. COVID was really good for, well, it was terrible, but one of the silver linings was that meetups started going global in a way. And so if there's a city near you that's hosting a meetup, but it's too far to drive, there's a good chance it's also online, so you can check it out and build your local network. Or if you're really enthusiastic, you can start your own group. So there's a link about it in the show notes. And those are great places to meet people and get help. And then if you don't want to do the group thing, then there are some online resources you can go to. So I will now tell you about those. First of all, if you're reading this book, there is the Ray Wenderlich book forum, which is just full of people that are going through the same content as you at the same time. So that's a great place to get help. And I know that the authors and editors are also active there answering questions. And I do recommend that. And then in addition to the book forum, there's, of course, Trusty Stack Overflow, where there's lots of great old questions and new ones coming up, and people are always answering questions there, and it's a great place to go. And there's the Flutter Dev Reddit, which is very active as well, and maybe not for technical questions, but more for community questions, you can go there. And there is also the Flutter Community Slack, which has 15,000 plus people. It's growing every week. And there are a lot of different places that you can just get help there. And there is also the Flutter Discord, in addition to the Ray Wenderlich Discord, which has a Flutter channel. So the links for both of those are in the show notes again. And finally, here, of course, there's Hump Day Q&A. So we've got a book author, we've got some GDEs and just really talented Flutter developers here to help you. And if we can get to your question and it's relevant, we will. So I hope that will be helpful. So that's all I've got.
Thank you, Sarah. That's so the takeaway here is the fact that if you have questions, there are ways to get them answered.
Yes,
So,
lots of ways
to go and people to learn from. So that's great. Thank you very much, Sarah. And for everybody that doesn't know, Sarah is really the driving force behind this. So we're very thankful that we have her here. And all right, so let's bring some more people up on the screen with us. We have Craig, of course. Can you come back on screen with us? That's awesome. Okay, and we definitely and let's bring Stef up. You know, she's with us here. That's awesome. And then we have a very special guest who actually is the one that wrote the chapter of the book that we're dealing with right here. So hi, Kevin.
Hi there.
Thank you for coming up here. So so given the way things go, I think our questions are in great hands.
We sure hope so.
All right, so do we have questions?
Yeah, we are ready. Waiting with bated breath for the first question.
So who's
Exactly. While waiting for the questions, I can remind you that you don't need to send your question again and again. We are already taking care of it. And do not forget to put Q in front of your questions so that we can find them easily. Yes, we have our first question right now. It comes from Jeff, and he is asking, where is the best place for a real newbie to ask questions? I feel kind of intimidated asking basic stuff, which we faced when we are newbie.
Yes, I definitely, I still have it. And I dealt with imposter syndrome for the longest time. Danielle will speak to helping me with that, as well as Scott and Sarah behind the scenes. So regardless of the fact that you're new, all of the resources that Sarah shared, and they're also down in the YouTube, the show notes, they're there. We also have, our forum, if it's specific to the book, that was displayed earlier. And so regardless of being new and being intimidated, just don't worry about it. That's one of the things that I love about the Flutter community is they're all so awesome when asking questions, and you don't have to feel intimidated at all. No question is dumb. I will every day, I remind myself it's okay to ask a question, because just because you don't know it, you need to know it or want to know it, there are people there that can help you. And not everybody knows everything. And I will admit that last week, I actually watched Simon look up something because he wasn't sure 100% on the answer. And I was blown away, because anybody who knows Simon knows everything about Flutter. And
Exactly.
So Jeff, ask your questions, look at the sources down below, and somebody will definitely be there to help you. Don't worry about being intimidated at all. Anybody else got anything to add?
Yeah,
Maybe Danielle can add.
Absolutely, I want to jump in too. In the Flutter community Slack workspace, there is a questions-beginner channel. Mm-hmm. So definitely want to add that you can ask questions there, and people are friendly; they don't bite. We do that. What I want to point out is the fact that not only is everything that's been mentioned and all the resources we've got available, I want to point out the fact that we've got Craig on here, and he actually works on the developer relations team at Google. We've got Kevin on here as a author of the book that Google is letting us all read for free, or letting us make it to where we can. So I want to point out the fact that we've had Googlers in the chat on YouTube. We've had former Googlers on the chat in YouTube. So not only are there lots of places to go, I want to point out the level of people that are involved and are out there. So intimidation should not be part of it. If you get to know us, you'll find out that we are the friendliest group of people out there, and we all are here because we genuinely love Flutter, and that we want you to succeed with it and stuff like that. So I understand feeling intimidated, but you don't need to. Once you find it out, we're there for you.
It's like ask your first question and then you're done. It's like you've gotten rid of that first question and you can go in. Once I ask my very first question, I'm like, okay, they're all humans. I can actually ask a question. And yeah. Kevin will know that because he and I worked on, he was one of my, my second article I tech edited at raywonderlight.com. And so if I don't know something, the docs, oh my gosh, you have to have the docs open. Always. Docs and your IDE. But anyway, yeah, so ask your question. Once you do your first one, you'll feel better.
Exactly. Now we have our second questions. What are the issues we will have when we try to develop a Flutter web application that uses Firestore? Are there issues with storing the API key or other credentials in the HTML source code?
I can take that one unless anyone else would like to. So you definitely do not want to store any of your API keys in your HTML. So you are on track to think, this doesn't seem right. And what you want to do instead, the only thing that'll be available in your DOM and in your in the JavaScript files that might get downloaded is just the URL to maybe your Cloud Firestore instance, maybe your project ID that those libraries use to figure everything out. But an individual user will securely store in their own browser their personal authentication token. And that will be sent with each request so that Firestore knows that who they say they are and that they're not lying about who they are. So that's your authentication and authorization tasks. So there shouldn't be any sensitive information stored in your HTML or in any JavaScript files. And the only sensitive parts will just be figured out whenever your user logs in, and it'll be unique to their browser. So hopefully that helps.
Craig, I've got a follow-up question based on that. What HTML is there in a Flutter web app?
Oh, very little. You just need, it's actually very similar to a React app, which if you're new to programming in general, that might not mean a lot. If you are just new to Flutter, it might mean something. But a lot of modern JavaScript, well, front-end JavaScript applications, frameworks, whatnot, excuse me, they just need kind of one div to anchor everything into. And then in the case of Flutter, it'll either be the canvas kit, putting a canvas in there, or a mix of canvas and HTML to render everything just in that one div. And then you'll have a big JavaScript include as well that brings in your Flutter app. So it's a very small footprint, but then it just gets inflated into your entire app.
But that's not something that we write and care about, right?
How much of that is generated? No, I don't think you have to write much. When you make a Flutter for Web app, a file will be generated and it has those lines for you. And that's important because you might want to add to that. You're going to want to add your Google Analytics little snippet. You're going to want to add other stuff for sure before it's all said and done. So that file is generated and then it exists for real. And then you can start to tweak what's in the file.
Great. And I want to thank Jeff, because that was actually the same Jeff that asked that question. So thank you, Jeff, for asking questions.
Yeah, you dove right into it. Amazing.
See, it's not that hard to ask a question. You got great people to answer it.
Exactly. Now we can go for our next question, which is, what's recommended for persistence of sensitive data? Maybe we can start with this one, then we can go for sub questions.
So I'm not an encryption expert myself. I want to open it up to anyone else who has anything they want to say. I can only kind of hand wave and give general thoughts.
I will say that I did a little bit of search earlier, and I found a couple libraries. One's called Encrypted Shared Preferences 2.0. I have not used these, just to let you know, but there are a bunch of libraries on there for doing that. Some of them are just, probably thin wrappers around shared preferences. But, I definitely recommend, especially if you're doing anything sensitive, to encrypt your data. And using SALT, of course, I didn't see anything about that in any of these libraries, but that's always important for making sure your, things are encrypted properly.
Yeah, maybe I can ping the sub question. Sensitive data hard-coded in the app, and sensitive data that was generated on runtime, like an authentication secret.
Yeah, the authentication secret is often just stored in memory. If you do want it to persist so the user stays logged in, then I certainly expect that like local storage within the app is encrypted, but that doesn't matter a ton, because you're talking about that's only going to be compromised if someone steals the person's laptop and is able to like log into their laptop. And if that happens, then they're going to be able to log in to all the sites via that laptop. And it's hard to get around that. So in general, I think you're basically okay there, but it's a good concern to want to keep all of your users' data encrypted at rest. That's the way people talk about this. Say, is the data encrypted at rest, or is it in plain text at rest? And wanting it to be encrypted is a great idea. And libraries will often, if you're using browser local storage, you can look that up. If you're using a specific library like Kevin found, it should just be pretty clear on how well encrypted that data is at rest.
Yeah, a lot of times people do just store like an auth token. That way, once they're logged in, that's the only thing they store. They don't store the username, password, any of those kind of things. So that next time they come up, they can basically re-log in with that auth token.
Okay, thank you. And then the next question is coming. What's the best way to persist files like MP3? How can we encrypt this to now allow users to use these files outside the application?
So there is a path provider library that gives you some access to files and things like that. So you can use that to get access to your documents directory, things like that. So and then there's files, so you can save it as a string and so forth. Crypting, there's an encrypt library that I found, Encrypt 5.01. So there's a lot of different ways of doing that, but those are the ones that I found.
Yes, one thing I'll add to that is the folks, well, it might just be one person who is behind Hive, which we're going to talk about a little bit in the upcoming chapter 15 part. They are working on their latest and greatest, basically successor to Hive, and it has very strong encryption at rest. I think it's called ISAR or ISTAR or something like that. So look for that coming to the Flutter community near you. And it does a great job of encrypting everything at rest. So again, just like Kevin was saying, you could get all of the bytes in a song or any file and maybe get them base 64 encoded, or however you kind of want to prepare that data to, again, sit at rest. And all you have to do is throw it into this upcoming library, or you pass it through an encryption library. And then Path Provider is a great option if you just want to store simple data, but encrypted database is also coming. ISAR, yes, thank you, Randall. ISAR is what it's called, ISAR.
Now, is encrypt really the right word that we're trying to come up with then? You don't have to encrypt something to let it be used outside the application. Do you have to do anything other than save it to a specific place?
Well, it depends. If if you're just saving an MP3 and it's like someone's favorite song, then maybe you don't care if it's encrypted. But if it's an audio byte, a reminder note for themselves for later, maybe you want it encrypted. So I think that is probably use case dependent. If I understood your question correctly there, Danielle.
Well, no, it's just you're talking about encrypting it so that we can use it in other, in other apps. So normally the encryption we're talking about here isn't something that would necessarily be, unless we're wrapping a password around it or something like that, to be used in another app. So I just wasn't sure that encrypt was really what he meant, or whether he meant like the format of it, to set it up so that so the MP3 could be played from your music player.
Yeah. In terms of encrypting it for a different app, that is a whole nother concern, because you need to encrypt it and someone else needs to decrypt it. So now you're talking about public-private key. But if you're just encrypting it for yourself so that it's secure at rest, well, then you're encrypting it and you're decrypting it. So that scenario is a bit simpler.
Agreed. I'm sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
I was going to say, and there are also issues about actually where you can save files. I'm not as familiar with iOS, but on Android, you can save files to your own app directories, but to personal ones, you have to get permissions, and it's a lot of work to do all that. So.
Okay, now our next question. Is it okay to hold shared preferences loaded during all the app runtime, like Craig did it in APOD?
If Craig did it, it's okay.
Astronomy, yeah.
No. Never conclude that if I do it, it's automatically okay. It's a terrible conclusion.
So one thing I saw about what Craig did that I really liked is the fact that by doing that interface, by passing in and saving that shared preferences, you don't have to await for it every time, because that is one of the problems I had. That means that every single method that uses it then has to await it. By doing what he did, you only have to do that once to get the shared preference instance, and then the get keys, save key type things just work fast. So that's nice.
And there's another layer to your question here, which may have been part of what you were thinking about. Just, is it safe to store that much information in memory? And that, of course, depends on how much information you have. If you're the Spotify app and you're saving every liked song because someone has premium and they've clicked the download all the songs button, then you probably can't. You're gonna have to be a little more clever and juggle it back and forth. But we're just storing a list of instruments, so we've got about 1 billion times more memory available to us than we're taking up with those numbers. So it was safe on our part, but it definitely kind of depends, and you have to feel it out.
Okay, now we can go for our next question. Is it good practice to use shared preferences for storing info like team mode, dark and light, or like the user language?
Yeah, my understanding is that is actually the original intended purpose of those libraries. Just little simple flags. It works very, very well for that.
Exactly. Now we can go for our next question, if we have one.
I saw a handful of questions about, here we go.
Can we store a list of data in shared preferences?
Well,
List of data.
Kevin, do you have any thoughts you want to share?
Yeah, you can definitely do it. And there's another question coming up too about basically how much data to share. And I mean, they really recommend that you don't do that. You can. You can actually persist classes by making it into a string and then serializing it and unserializing it. But it's usually not the best use of shared preferences. Like you said, it's mostly for flags and small bits of data. So.
Yeah, in the next section, we're going to talk about how basically as soon as we started using shared preferences, we felt like we were outgrowing it. So stay tuned for, the book uses SQLite, and SQLite's a great option. And you can learn everything about using SQLite by reading chapter 15. We're going to cover the exact same concepts, just with a little different, some different tools, kind of highlight that there's always different ways to implement the same features. And it is going to be Hive coming up in chapter 15. So yeah, we quickly outgrew shared preferences, and then there's options for kind of more robust data.
So Craig, is part of the reason that you're going to Hive because we've not yet covered the SQL, the streams that we needed to have for SQLite, or was there another reason you opted to do that?
Yeah, so I get into it a bit in in the section, but and this is a little bit of kind of personal, my flavor. So don't take this as gospel. If you know that you need to use shared preference or a SQLite, you know that you need a relational database on your client, then don't listen to me. Use SQLite because you're probably correct. But my strong suspicion is that many people, and I talk about this a little bit in the chapter 15 part, but I think a lot of people know, well, I'm using relational data on the back end, so it's very natural to use relational data on the front end. But I think that it's a lot simpler, and that many apps, not all, of course, but many apps can get everything they need out of just a document-based storage on their client. And so Hive and some others offer great implementations of that. The book's got a very thorough walkthrough of how to do it with SQLite and more, which is a great, actually more is being renamed to Drift. So keep that in the back of your mind. That's coming soon.
It's on our list. It's on our list for updates.
Nice.
And my question is more because like my day job is SQL. So
gotcha.
When we did the SQLite stuff, I was in heaven, sort of, because I was combining my two worlds. Kevin will attest to that.
Yeah.
Because I made, there were just because that's my true expertise. I mean, I can't wait till I have 25 years of Flutter experience.
Yeah. So I really do share your love of relational data. Before I'm primarily a backend developer and, love Postgres and ORMs and thinking about data normalization, like right there with you. But whenever I build an app, I always find that I do still only want one source of truth. And I want it to be on the back end. And so then I'm going to get some kind of prepared API response from the back end, and I'll just cache that as one document on the front end. Right. And I don't think about caching on my front end relational data and then like restitching it together. And of course, if you know you need to do that, then you need to do that. But I think most apps don't need to. So,
yeah, good points. Thank you.
The one thing I will say is that, sorry. One thing I was going to say is that it's really, sometimes it's important to have that data, because if you don't have internet, then you have no data and your app doesn't work at all. So that is one consideration for backend databases.
Client-side databases, you mean?
Yeah.
Yep.
So, okay, maybe we can get our last question since we shove it up multiple times so that I think we need to answer it, Let's read it out. So, is it a good idea to store login token in shared preferences, not password? I was involved in a startup that used authorization by email token and was saving it to the preferences to persist login.
So one thing I'll point out is that if you're sharing an API token, that is kind of equivalent to sharing a password. Granted, you would like never, ever share a password on the client, but sharing an API token is kind of similar because it's the keys to the castle. With that, you can get access to all the things, right? And you need the password to get access to the API token. So like, they're kind of similar. So I would only share an API token in a place that you trust is very secure. Now that said, I think all of those user defaults on iOS, shared preferences on Android, I think those are encrypted at rest. But you'd have to make sure before you put sensitive information in there. And if not, then find an encrypted alternate.
So
anything to add, Steph?
Oh yeah, sorry. One thing regarding what Craig was saying about the API token being, the similar to a password. For people who are brand new at programming or brand new at using GitHub or anything like that, you don't want to post it, especially if it's a public GitHub location, because then your API key is out there. It's the internet. It's there forever.
Yeah, you don't want to commit that information as source code anywhere.
Yes.
All right, this was a great question and answer segment. Thank you. I think that Craig and Kevin can go away for a little bit.
Thank you.
And it's time to bring up Scott, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about how we can support the Flutter community, because as you all know, we're doing this for free for you, and you're able to watch this for free, and it's not free for us to make it. There's definitely resources that are involved in us being able to support all of this, and Scott's here to tell us how you can help out with that.
I appreciate it, Danielle. Let me see real quick there. Hi, Steph. Bye, Steph.
Hi.
All right, Flutter community. I'm going to try and keep it fairly short, but a little bit different than other times in case you've heard it before. When we first started the Flutter community in 2017, there were about 5 of us, and we weren't working full time. So we had a lot of time to do these things. We had a lot of time to build the resources and the support structure. We all have jobs now. So one of the things we're hoping to do is hire a community manager. Now, why would we need a community manager? Well, let's see here. Let me count the ways. Flutter Community has the Flutter Community Medium, okay, which has about 600,000 views every 30 days. And we also have the Slack, which if you look at the little red arrow going back and forth, you will see as of this, it had 15,300 at the time this was made. Well, I can tell you right now, I checked it this morning. The Slack has 16,500 plus members. So if you ever want this to be a paid Slack, that's going to be $5 US per month per person. That's not going to happen. Anyway, moving on. We also have the Flutter Community GitHub, which is for orphaned packages. Basically, sometimes people will produce a great package and then they won't have time to maintain it anymore. We find homes to adopt it. We find people to adopt the packages so that they won't go away. Then that is also more of the GitHub right there. We've also been behind a number of events and we want to do more. It's getting a little hard though with a lack of time. But some of the events we've done are Hack 19, Hack 20. We do a lot of shows with Hump Day Q&A, bringing you Googlers such as the other Kevin Moore, Miriam, who is product owner of the web of Flutter Web, and Chris Sells. We also do little things like have speakers for your GDGs and meetups. That ugly guy down there is kind of me. Then we also do bigger events, such as this was DroidCon London, Flutter Europe, the Flutter Global Summit 21, which this one's in December. We also had one earlier this week. Then after Flutter Interact, we happened to have a whole lot of people in town at the same time, so we put a dozen of us up on stage and had the Flutter Community panel. Then there are other things, such as working with Google for the 30 days of Flutter. Flutter Vikings was another event. The Flutteristas Conference, the only 4-day event I have ever seen around Flutter. I almost put the ladies up on screen. They were cheering. There are also some other interviews. Jay has interviewed Nilay and the creator of Flutter Redux, Brian Egan. Then also Martin Jarrett, CEO for Nevercode, and Philip, who is in our chat right now. He used to be on the Flutter team, and now he's off having fun back at home with his family. We also have some videos for things such as Value Notifier and then Hump Day Q&A. We try to get out here with people such as Diego and Argel for GDEs to help you out with that. But we can't always be here every week because, as I said, it's getting a little busier and busier. So we want to try to hire a community manager in order to take over a lot of this and make sure we can keep bringing you all this great content. And that Patreon is right there at patreon.com/Flutter_community. Again, that is www.patreon.com/Flutter_community. And I don't want this to start sounding like an advertisement, so I won't say it again. But with that, let's get back to what you're really here for. Danielle,
Hey
why
there.
don't you take back over?
Thank you, Scott. And all I'm going to really do right here is throw it right back to Craig. We're going to take the next section. This is actually chapter 15, and that's not the right view of Craig. We actually need the view with him. The view set up for him to present to us.
All right, welcome back. Chapter 15, if you read it, was all about storing our data. It's kind of an upgrade on chapter 9, which is why the order was chosen the way it was. So we're upgrading how we think about persisting some data from just simple shared preferences, which we already we were all immediately feeling like we were outgrowing its capacity, as we just wanted to store a list of numbers. So, okay, shared preferences isn't quite good enough. Chapter 15 introduces SQLite and libraries to even make SQLite a little easier. But just like we did last week when we looked at deep linking and nav2 and thought, well, let's maybe offer a different way that's a bit easier. That's what I'm doing again this week. So instead of thinking about getting a SQLite database running in our app, because I very strongly suspect that almost no applications actually need a full SQLite database on the client side. If you have highly relational data and you are querying against it a lot and you need very, very fast responses, then a SQLite database is possibly required. But I really believe that for 9 out of 10, maybe more, apps, you don't actually need a SQLite database. And I suspect that many folks using it are doing so only because that's the kind of persistence they know. You use a database on the back end, well, it seems natural to use one on the front end. But we're going to explore something different here. So, and then in chapter 15, they also talk about adding like a data repository. And so as we free up some of our complexity and what we're worrying about by not going completely into SQLite, we'll spend some of that mental energy on continuing the conversation that we had in chapter 9 about paying better attention to who knows what in our code base. So be a conscious consumer, they said. This is a bit of advice that we all hear in real life. You know, you should know where your food comes from. You should know where your clothes comes from. You should know where your garbage goes to when you throw it out. You should know what you should recycle, what you should not recycle. These things are important to live in the real world and not ruin it. But it's not necessarily true whether or not having that same kind of awareness, right? Seeing things before they get to you and then watching them, paying attention to where they go after they leave. It's not obvious whether or not those same principles should apply to code that we write. So we're going to kind of explore that real quick here. So let's think about the Flutter app that we've been building, whether it's food or lich, astronomy picture of the day, or anything else. On the one hand, you have your UI, and that's Flutter app, and we talk about that a lot. And then there's been a question of, how does that UI know what to draw? How does it, have any sense of what should go where? Well, we've been talking to these very simple classes. We call them managers. And we've used change notifier and provider to have our Flutter widgets find out what the heck they should do. But this change notifier and provider solution that we've had it's got a lot on its plate. It's had to store data. It's had to fetch data. It's had to maintain internal state. It's had to update widgets on when it's their turn to do something. And this is just a lot to get right. Like for us as programmers, it's a lot to put into one layer and have it all behave correctly. So instead of just thinking about our UI and our state, and again, we haven't even gotten to state management yet in this course, but instead of just thinking about those two as kind of our components in our app, I want to propose that there's more than that. So obviously we have the UI. This is all the Flutter widgets, and it's what we, it's the first thing that you learn when you start working on Flutter. And then there's state, and everyone knows that there is state management. It's the biggest question in Flutter development is, what state management package should I use? And we'll get to that one day. But there's another part that I find to be really important in maintaining an understandable and maintainable code base. And that is your data layer. This is what's responsible for going and getting data in the first place, but also holding on to it, persisting it from one session to the next, and keeping it available in memory for different state management classes. Because as we've gotten further in here, we've seen we have a journal manager, we have a favorites manager, we have an APOD manager, and these are going to start to intersect. And what if one day we want to like attach our astronomy pictures of the day to a journal entry? If we're not careful, they're both going to be reloading the same astronomy picture of the day entry. So it'll be very helpful for us if we separate out our data layer and allow any of our state management classes, any of those managers, notifiers, whatever we call them, to go ask our dedicated data layer, hey, do you have an astronomy picture of the day for this given ID? Do you have a journal entry for this given ID? And that, of course, you can see why this is coming up now as we're hitting chapters about persisting data with databases and shared preferences and all that. So let's think about how we've been building this so far. First of all, for us, certainly in the Astronomy Picture of the Day app, our state and data have just been this kind of amorphous blob. It's been very difficult to tell where one ends and one begins. So this has set us up for a few problems. Our UI and our state, they know about each other, they talk to each other. That's fine. That's good. You're certainly going to need to have that. But we've also, because our state and our data have just kind of not provided a coherent offering to our UI, we've had our UI know about our data layer. We've been initializing that mock APOD service in our widgets. And this is like the worst thing that you can do, and we are not going to do it anymore. So thinking about, oh, I jumped forward. Okay, you're spoiling the punchline here. Can we go back? There we go. Okay, we got these things, right? And instead of having like a lot of different arrows going each way, and that blob around state and data is supposed to reference definitely tons of arrows back and forth between those two, we're gonna try to do things a little better here. So instead of even arranging these as a triangle, let's think about having a flow where we go from our UI to our state to our data layer, and we only communicate along this axis. So obviously our UI and our state, they know about each other, that's fine. And our state and our data layer will know about each other, of course, but our UI and our data layer shall never meet. Okay, so I'm proposing that your code should not be conscious consumers. They shouldn't know where anything that they get comes from, and they definitely shouldn't know what's happening to anything that they send off, right? You throw out garbage, it's good to know, hey, did that go to a landfill? Is it just being dumped in the ocean? If so, I should recycle it. But that is not true for your data layer. When your data layer is asked for some data and sends it off, it's just like, bye, and never thinks about it again. So the more layers in your code that you could ask them about what they do, and they know that, but if you ask them about literally anything else, those parts of your code would go, well, I literally have no idea. I don't have a clue how that works. The more of those you have, the better. So now we're going to talk about a data layer for your Flutter apps. And we're going to use a library called Hive because it's a lot easier than a full database. And if you know that you need a full database, SQLite is the way to go. Also, SQLite doesn't work in the web. That's another reason I want to use Hive for this, because we've been doing deep linking. We've been thinking about the web, and SQLite is actually, you know, with more, it does work in the web. Sorry, I take that back. But it's more work to get it going in the web. Hive just works everywhere, very simply, and doesn't have the additional mental overhead for us of maintaining a relational database. So let's do it. I need to zoom out. There we go. All right. So in thinking about a data layer that will ultimately be realized in Hive, what I've found is kind of nice is to have even our data layer internally is going to have layers. So get ready. But it's nice to have a set of methods that we know everything implements. And we saw the first bit of this when we had that just simple persistence class, and then we immediately implemented it in a shared preferences persistence class, and it was on the hook to implement those two methods, set key and get key. So the first thing that I did is just think about what I call a data contract. And if you want to do data stuff, one of my apps, you have to sign this data contract. And these are the methods that I think you need if you are involved in my data layer. So you need to be able to set an item. You need to be able to get an item. You need to be able to give me multiple items, basically all of them. You need to be able to tell me what's favorited. And you need to be able to set/toggle a favorite. So that's kind of some very simple set of operations that gets us far. Now, we're using generics here, and you've seen this already every time you've made a list, and you have to tell Dart, this is a list of what, right? Is this a list of integers, strings? It's a list of what? Well, you can do that on your own as well. You can make your own class, and it's going to do whatever it does, but you can say it's going to do whatever it does on what, on something, and you can allow that to be specified later, just like the list class allows you to specify what goes into it. You are going to make this data contract class and allow future you to say what goes into a given instance of data contract. And one thing, this is all very ID based. So we make a base class as well that we just call data model or base model or something like that, and specify, hey, what do you need to be kind of friendly with our entire data model? Well, you just need an ID. And I'm thinking ahead to Firestore, by the way, which uses strings for IDs. And I've converted all of our IDs in the APOD app from integers to strings. So that is going to kind of set us up nicely for when we start using Firestore. And also using Hive locally is very compatible with Firestore because they're both document-based databases instead of relational databases. So we have this data contract, and it defines these methods. And then this is just like a little convenience for our own organization. And you'll see what this source is in a second. Actually, we're going to see what the source is right now. So we'll look at our local memory source. So I do not have it. Why don't I have it? What? This is very surprising. Do I have a repository? I do. That's good. What happened to my source? Oh, there it is. All right, it had a different file name at this step. Kind of not a great file name. Okay, so toward the goal of caching data locally, having really coherent and straightforward access to that data, I like to think about having different data sources that, again, implement they extend to source. And the distinction there is coming momentarily. But source, of course, is just another pointer to data contract. So for now, we can think of our sources as extending data contract. And they get a type, and that's basically just going to be one of our data classes in our app that has an ID. Could be a journal entry, could be an APOD, could be a recipe, could be ingredients, could be anything. And we store a map of IDs to objects, and we store a set of favorited IDs. And here, our implementation for each of these methods is very simple. You want to get the favorited IDs, you just return the set, convert it into a list. You want to get an item, you just look up in the key, or in our map, by the way, by the supplied key, you return the item. This is very, very simple. Very straightforward implementations for all of these methods. So now we can look at repository. And repository is in chapter 15. And a repository is something that has a lot, it is the entry point for the data layer, and your state management talks to it. So your change notifiers, your block, if you go in that direction, your river pod classes, they will talk to the repository, and they have no idea how the repository works. But this is how the repository works. Of course, it has to know how it works. So it's going to just maintain a list of sources, and it extends data contract. And because all of these things extend the same classes, they can call the same methods on each other as we drill deeper into our data layer. So if we want to call get favorite IDs on our repository, well, it'll say, okay, I'm going to loop over my list of sources. And each time for each source, I'll say, hey, source. First one it's going to hit is the local memory source. Do you have any favorite IDs? And if it has favorite IDs, then we're all set. So they're not empty, and we're done. We break. Here, we just find any empty sources and backfill them. Kind of hold on to that thought for now. We return our favorite IDs, and we do this for every read method. Get item, we're going to loop over our sources and say, okay, Mr. Source, Mrs. Source, whomever you are, do you have the item of the ID? As soon as a source says yes, all right, we're done. We break out of the list and we move on. We backfill any sources that we already found that were empty, and we return the item. Get items, same thing. Try to get the items. As soon as you find it, great. Fill any empty sources. By the way, this code is all on GitHub. And you can ask questions in Discord. You can DM me. This is all out there. We can work through this together. You don't have to perfectly absorb all this right now, but we're going to backfill any of our empty sources, and then we return the items. Writing is simpler. We just loop over each source and call the write operation. So set favorite, we just loop over all the sources and call set favorite. Set item, we loop over all the sources and call set item. And you can guess what happens for toggle favorite. We loop over all the sources and we call toggle favorite. Now, let's look at main.dart and see how this is starting to come together. We make a repository, and it's going to store astronomy pictures of the day. And we give it a source list that for now just has one, and that's our local memory source. So we're actually kind of rolling back our functionality temporarily, because we are not replacing shared preferences with anything that does the same amount of work. In fact, I've even deleted shared preferences. So if we go to HubSpec, if I could type, we will see that I didn't delete shared preferences, but I'm going to. It's not long for this world. Nice. Okay, so we make a repository, and we're going to give it a list of sources. And the important thing here is that we start in more accessible, and we're going to work to more remote. So the first item in our source list will always be just local memory running in the app. This is how everything has worked before. And then we're going to stick below that a local persistence source. Okay, so let me take a step forward here. Let's go to Git checkout chapter 15, step 2. We're going to actually use this repository because we have the APOD repository here, but not even using it yet. So I'll take a step forward and it's building everything. Okay, so we are no longer using our favorites manager. We are now just thinking about having an astronomy picture of the day repository. And we're still providing it like we did before. Oh wait, we have a favorites manager. Oh, I'm passing it to repository. The further refactors are coming. We pass to our favorites manager the repository. So let's hop in to favorites manager and see what this is doing. This used to take our persistence class. Before that, it directly took the shared preferences raw implementation from the plugin. But now it's taking this APOD repository and it's still doing some pretty simple things. You want to get all the favorite IDs? Just ask the repository for that. You want to see if something is favorited? Well, you still ask the repository for that. You want to toggle a favorite? Tell the repository to do that and then notify listeners. So now our favorites manager is really kind of at peak I just work here status. This favorites manager is just kind of a translator between our front end and the repository. And this is good state management because we might have to do some more business logic here, and that's okay. But we are basically, in many scenarios, we will just go to the repository, get whatever data we need, and then store it. We might do a little mutation, modification to it, and then we just call notify listeners. So it's like, cool, I got something from the repository. I have no idea where this came from, how it works. Just trust that it's correct. And then I press my notify listeners button, and I have no idea who are the listeners. I don't know who I'm notifying. I don't care. And this is good state management. So let's see, what's the next thing here? This is our favorites manager. Oh, and our favorites APOD tab. Here, we now are able to finally stop initializing an instance of our mock APOD service in a widgets build method. That was the single dirtiest thing that we were doing in this app. But we are now just using our favorites manager and calling the method. There's a way that we're cheating though. I wonder if I added that in this step or not. Yes, okay. So we're still cheating. We're a little bit more here because it's chapter 10 and 11 where we start to do object serialization and network requests. So in those chapters, we'll be able to get rid of our of these methods where we still have to tell our repository what all of the information is by reading those old files. So we still have our mock APOD service, and it still is going to have to get the recent APODs, and that just reads the JSON file because we haven't gotten to that layer of our technology yet. And then it puts each one into the repository. So this is like a little bit of cheating that we're doing, but in the next chapter, we'll get rid of that. So we're now using our repository. We've made this repository. Internally, it already has sources. Look at how just kind of like dumb the repository is. It doesn't know how any of these sources work. It doesn't know that they're even different from each other. It just takes a list of sources that are data contracts themselves as well and loops over them, calls this method, very simple. And this backfill part, well, actually, let's take a step forward because then that's going to make a little more sense. So git checkout chapter 15, step 3. Yes, Hive local persistence. So let's go to, everything's running, we're installing things. There's a new class in town and it's called, what's it called? Local persistence source. So local persistence source also stores items that are data models, and it extends source just like local memory source did, but local persistence source knows about Hive. And Hive has a really nice, simple API that looks a lot like our local memory source, honestly, except it saves the data forever. So the Hive has this idea of boxes, and those are very similar. They're analogous to kind of tables in SQLite. Not perfectly, but we can just think of them as tables. That's how I always use Hive. And each of our local persistence source instances, we know we're going to have one for astronomy pictures of the day. We're going to have another one for journals, and any other kind of different types of data that we work on in our app, we're going to initialize some of these for. So it's going to have a box, which is again Hive jargon, very similar to tables. It's going to have a box for all of the items. And I've just left a little helper for myself here. This is going to store maps of strings, which are IDs, to instances of T. T stands for type, by the way. And then we're going to have another box, and this is just going to store also a map when it's strings to booleans, and our value for bool is always true. So if your ID is in here, then you are favorited. And we implement all of our same methods. Oh, this ready method, this just allows Hive to initialize. We call that in main.dart. So by the way, we make our new, actually, let's hold off on this. Pretend you didn't see the ready method. Let's focus on these methods first. Get favorite IDs. We just ask Hive, hey, in that favorites box, give me all the keys. They're strings, by the way. I'd like them now. When we ask the Hive persistence for an item, we give it a string. We say, okay, Mr. Hive, I've got this item for you. It's a map of string to dynamic, by the way. Turn it into our object. I'd like it now. And so we implement all of these same methods again. We've got, well, we must, because that's the data contract. So they're all implemented here, and they all just kind of do very simple things with either item box or favorites box. Now, back in main.dart, we have our repository. This is where we should look first. Before, we only had our local memory source. So we had lost the ability to persist data. But now we're adding this Hive persistence source. It's local persistence source called apod Hive. Honestly, this wasn't the best name I've ever given anything. But it's that we know what it is. It's the local persistence source object. And we add that to our repository's source list. And this is going to be pretty interesting, because when we go into the repository, let's think about what these methods do in these loops. We say, get favorite IDs. Okay, for source in source list, the first one is local memory. So we say, hey, local memory source, do you know anything about favorite IDs? And let's pretend the local memory source says, sure don't, because we just launched the app, or it's the first time, or some such. So we get back empty favorite IDs from our local memory source. So we say it's empty. Okay, that's a problem. Let's note that local memory had no idea about this. Okay, that's fine. Now we go back, we go to our next source. This is local persistence source. And we say, hey, local persistence source, do you know anything about these favorite IDs? And let's say it does, because this is a fresh launch of the app, but the user's been here before. So they favorited a bunch of things, but we've just launched the app. That's why local memory had no idea, but local persistence, like, oh yeah, of course, they favorited these 10 things. So we get back 10 favorite IDs here. We say, great, it's not empty, so we're done with this loop. Then we drop down here and we say, well, if we found some favorite IDs and there were some sources that didn't know about those IDs, then we'll loop over all the sources and we'll update them. So this part basically just allows the local memory source to catch up. Now, in the future, we call this method again. What happens? Well, we loop over the sources. The first one that we get from our source list is local memory source. Local memory source, we ask it, hey, what do you know about favorite IDs? And it says, aha, I got these 10. And we say, great. So we have favorite IDs. It is not empty, so we break. We drop down here. Favorite IDs is not empty. We have the 10, that's cool, but no empty sources, nothing to do there. So we just continue. We return the favorite IDs. This allows us to not have to go to Hive every single time we want that information. We get it from local memory, which is as fast as anything could be, once we load it from Hive once, just one time. And now that we have 2 sources, we start to see how these loops that we have in all of our different methods on the repository are going to really help us as we start to stitch this together. And in chapter 10 and 11, we're going to add an API source to this. So at that point, we're going to say, local memory, do you know anything about it? If it says, oh, all right, no worries. Local persistence, do you know anything about it? And if local persistence is like, oh, all right, get out of here, you're all useless. And then we say API source, do you know anything about it? And that's when we're going to finally make a call to the NASA API and get some astronomy pictures of the day. And they're going to come back, and then we're going to store them in Hive, and then we're going to store them in local memory, and then we're going to return them to our app. And that is going to be slick. So if you felt like this was a little dizzying, stay tuned next week when it all comes together and we have this nice data layer. It's really going to be neat. But this is how the repository works. And we look back at main, and we have our repository. And all we did in this step is we initialized this local persistence for APODs. I just made it up here because we have to call ready. So that's all that is. And then we pass it to the repository. Ready, that was the method that we skipped over briefly. That just allows Hive to kind of get going, load its files, figure out where it is, whatever, right? Hive's now ready to go. Our repository, nothing changed about the repository in this step. We're still doing this cheating because we haven't made our API source yet. It's going to be so fun to delete this next week. And nothing else changes. And we look here, and we've got structured data saved, and we can perform all the same operations that we could before, where we get rid of items, they go away, they come back. But now all of this data is persisting from one step to the next, but we're not shoehorning the functionality into shared preferences and really outgrowing what it's capable of. We're using Hive, which can store full documents. These full documents are the same exact structure as Firestore. They're just maps of strings to dynamic. And so in the last chapter of this, when we add Firestore, that is going to fit in so nicely with Hive, where we can just easily cache items locally if we want, and only go ask Firestore for data when we need it. Remember, Firestore, you pay for every document read. How valuable to store them locally so we don't have to keep paying to read these records over and over and over again. So a little bit of an adventurous, experimental take on chapter 15. I'll be very curious to find out for you all, did this make sense? Did this work? Was it too much? Was it too fast? Was it too slow? But if we're talking about making a real app, then I think it's very important to talk about having a real data layer. And this was a bit of a crash course, but next week we're going to tie it all together when we get into networking and API sources. And that part is going to be really fun. So for now, let's go back to questions and see how everyone's doing.
All right. Thank you very much, Craig. That was very insightful as always. And we need to have my co-host Esra coming back on. All right. Hey,
Thank you,
Esra, that was
Craig.
great, wasn't it? Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
All right. Well, we're getting ready for another questions and answers. So let's go ahead and bring back up Craig and Kevin. And then let's bring up Also, let's bring up. Okay, so Kevin is here. Okay, but his camera is not working right now, so he's here to answer stuff, but he's going to sound sort of like God coming from above, you know. So say hi, Kevin. Maybe. And maybe he's not here.
Maybe not.
All right. Well, we also need to bring Stef back up. We have our everybody's favorite tech editor here, and then yay, we have Simon. So Simon's going to be here also. So
hello.
Welcome,
Hey,
Simon.
Simon.
Better late than
Welcome
never.
back.
Yeah, thanks very much.
He
Yeah, I'm not at
was-
my best today, so apologies, but we'll see if we get through some questions.
And I did. I did hear rumors that he was yelling at his TV screen while we were doing the first part. So
It's not that bad.
all right,
Exactly.
if we figured out how to get Kevin's voice on here. Okay.
Try turning it off and on again.
All right, well, let's get to some questions here.
Yeah, let's get some questions. All right. Moomin asks, do you have plans to publish an advanced Flutter book? Well, I would think that, especially since we don't have Kevin here, let's ask Stef that question.
Yes, we do. We have some authors currently working on a book titled Real
oh wow
World Flutter by Tutorials. Real World. I'm smiling. Whatever. So Real World Flutter by Tutorials. They are working on it with a 2022 published date. And
that's great.
It will be on the raywonderlight.com website.
I can't wait. I'm sure it's going to be great.
It's exciting. It's an intermediate book, or divine. Yeah. So it's make sure you've finished Flutter Apprentice. You can dive in, or even if you haven't done Flutter Apprentice, but Flutter, and it's real world apps.
All right, that's great. And I actually just got a text from my friend Christine, who's following along and learning Flutter as we go along. And she says she's seen a couple of things that didn't seem quite right in the book. What should I tell her to do?
Well, as we've discussed, and Stef's got a cough. Just a second. Sorry about that. Yes, I talk about myself in third person.
Yeah.
So scrolling across the bottom is the URL for our errata part of our forum. And so if you find a mistake, yes, we are human, we make mistakes. And we've had several posted. When you go there and you go to post a question, please review what's already been submitted, because we've had several duplicates and it makes it really hard for us to go through when the same thing's being asked multiple times. So go to the errata site and post in, and the more details you can give us, the better. Sorry.
All right, Christine, I know you're out there watching. That's the answer.
Yes.
All right, great. Next question. I cannot read that name, so I won't try to say it, but can you query and filter data in Hive?
So if by query you mean ask Hive for some data and get it, yes. Can you filter data? Yes. When you say, Hive, I've got this box, give me the items for it, you actually loop over the items with a, you often will chain these together. You'd be like box.open, whatever, and then .filter. You apply any items that you have, or any constraints that you have to the data that you want to receive. This does mean that Hive may not be the best if you have many thousands of records that you're caching on the device. It has no relational concepts. So this is, again, where we said earlier, if you know you have relational requirements and you need to write join queries, then Hive is not going to be an option for you. You'll need to go with full SQLite.
All right, great. Next question. Benet asks, would you rather store a fairly long JSON data as a file and store meta info in the database, or would you store the JSON data itself in the database?
So there's a couple of bits here, right? So fairly long JSON data as a file, or store it as meta info in a database, or store it as JSON data itself in the database. Well, I'm not sure what I mean by meta info. I mean, if it's stored in a database, it's stored in a database as values.
I think they mean just some info in a database to know which JSON file to open.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. So, I mean, to be honest, it depends on your scenario, right? If you look at a very long JSON file, you want to store it on disk as a file itself. If it's an entity in itself, right? So if you don't need to search that data, if you don't need to process it, if it's just a blob of data that you're then retrieving, store it as a file, and then store the name of the file in your database alongside any other metadata for that entry, for example. It's quite common practice. I mean, it all depends on, do you need what you need from the database, right? So you might want to extract some fields that you might want to search out of that JSON file and put them as columns or other metadata in your database. But yeah, I mean, there's no need to overload the database with lots of data that's not going to change.
All right, great. Okay. Let's go with our next question.
Yeah, we saw it briefly.
I saw it a second ago.
Yeah.
It disappeared.
Well, it said. Oh, wait, no, we're skipping one here.
Yeah, this is a new question. This is not the one we had before.
I want to answer the other one before.
Yeah, let's do the other one.
It was about shared preferences in Android, I think.
Yes, and iOS.
Right.
Let's continue this one and we'll see where we get to.
All right, we're going to get back to the other one. We're going to get back.
There we go.
We got it.
We got it.
All right.
Right.
Okay. And
so
the question is usage of shared preferences on Android the same as it is on iOS?
No. It's actually interesting. Shared preferences is the name given to Android's implementation of this since day one. This has been in Android since the very beginning. I want to kind of mention something about shared preferences that most people don't realize. If you store something in shared preferences, it is a key value store for basic data. You don't want to store large data in there. So what happens is it has to cross the platform channel, that is from your dark code, to be serialized, sent across the platform. The platform then, this is what's funny, stores it. So if you're doing JSON, it's a big string, probably, because it's not structured data at that point. You're storing it as a string. That string is then synchronized various mechanisms to an XML file by the platform and then stored to disk, which you could have just read and written to straight from Dart. So to avoid that whole loop, you might as well just store your preferences in a JSON file. That's what I would suggest. That's a bit more complicated than just using the plugin, though, right? There is a disadvantage to doing it that way, though, and that is that file is not backed up by Android. So in shared preferences, the automatic backup feature of Android will save the shared preferences for you. So, you kind of got, you use it for the cases that you require. So simple things like a login token could be stored in the shared preferences. Something to mention that shared preferences are stored in the private directory of your application. They're not accessible to any other app or publicly accessible in any way. You can't share them that way. So it does mean that you can store like secure information in there and know that unless you purposefully send that data to another application, it's not going to go anywhere. So yeah, you don't need secure shared preferences where it encrypts them and does all sorts of other fun things. It's just tokens that you get for login are not private in that fashion, right? They're not encryption keys, right? So yeah. Anyway, sorry, that's my whole thing about shared preferences. But yeah, on iOS it uses a different mechanism, which I'm just gonna grab the name of because I forgot.
User defaults.
User defaults. That's the one. Yeah. NS user defaults. Yeah.
Craig for the win here. Well, I see something like this, and I wouldn't dream of using specifically shared preferences. In my Flutter app, I would use a package.
Shared preferences, but shared preferences is the package, right? And then
right, but that goes in and uses the user defaults on iOS already.
Yeah.
And so, to a certain extent, I would say it is the same, the usage of it.
Oh, sorry, yeah, the usage of it is
under the
same.
covers.
Yeah.
Under the covers is different, but the usage, if you're using the shared preferences package, would be the same.
You're just storing key value pairs, yeah, totally. Sorry, that was my misunderstanding. Yeah.
All right, let's have another question. All right, another Hive question. Okay, so CE Cross asks, is it worth investing in Hive knowing that ISAR is coming soon?
Well, that is a question that's going to be very hard to answer. It's an assignment answer. It depends. ISAR adds some relational knowledge to it. It's not going to be a full relational database like SQLite, but you can start to link data and have join type of functionality. ISAR also has encryption, like we mentioned, which is it's better encryption. Hive has like encryption light, but ISAR is going to have proper encryption. Now, they're both ultimately pretty document based. So if you start, like we talked about having different sources in the section just now. If you have a Hive source and then ISAR is released and you really like it and you want to swap it out, you're going to have a pretty targeted part of your code that you have to migrate over. So Hive works really, really well. I mean, ISAR is out. You can actually use it now. The developer's last thing he told me was that he wants to add more tests before he's confident that it's ready for prime time, but he thinks it all works. So
I've been there.
That's how ready ISAR is. But, do you want to use Hive in the meantime? That's something that, only you can answer.
I would mention just on this point is that the knowledge you're going to gain from just learning about databases using Hive is definitely portable, right? So the idea of how state persistence works and how you use databases is knowledge that can be shared, right? To whatever package you go to, they all fix the same problem. They all resolve the same problem, should I say? Sorry.
And that's one of the advantages of having those interfaces is, the upper levels don't know what you're using underneath the hood, so you could swap it out later on.
It's definitely, whenever you're dealing with any external system, you want to isolate it. You don't want to put it this way. I've done this before, and this I did as I think it was my very first Flutter app. Actually, I was using Firestore, and I decided to sprinkle Firestore all across the application. This was a very, very bad idea. I knew better at the time, but first Flutter app, you just hit keys until it works like a monkey. Then what ended up happening was then it had to come in and revamp it when we wanted to change the storage mechanism, which meant just a whole rewrite essentially, right? Whereas if you can isolate behind an interface of I want to read the user model, I want to write, I don't know, the person's preferences and whatever else the operations that your app needs, that's your interface. And then behind that, you can do whatever you want, however you want to do it. And you can keep changing that until you find the right thing for you.
I do find myself wondering if that was Kevin's standard for giving stuff over to Stef to tech edit. It should work. Or I think it should work.
Try it. See if it works. Does it work for you? Right.
No
All right,
comment. No, I'm kidding. Kevin gave me completed chapters.
Yeah, nowadays there's no QA people. We are QA, so we have to make sure it works.
That's true. That's true, but at least the testing system, I think, in Flutter works fairly well, so that's a good thing.
All right, team, I have to run, but I would love to, I'm literally being kicked out of the office that I'm in, but I would love to respond to this question while I'm on the go.
Please do.
Wow.
Hey, everyone. Sorry.
All right.
So what was this question? Do you want to read
The
someone
question
really off?
coming up here is, what's the difference in doing this local caching approach versus enabling persistence with Cloud Firestore?
So that's a great question. Cloud Firestore enabled persistence only keeps it in memory. It is not a reliable run-to-run persistence, which is disappointing. So if you store it yourself in Hive, then you will know that if you loaded the data before and you think it's saved, you won't be paying to load it again from Cloud Firestore. The persistence that is reliably enabled is auth stuff when you turn that on. That works better. I have to go.
All right.
Thanks for the answer.
You're definitely.
The levels that Craig will go, but this does bring up the fact that we are at the end of our time.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I definitely want to, and I wanted to bring Sarah back up, and we're at the end of our time, so we're going to have to move on. What happens for people that have questions that haven't been answered yet? Where should they be asking those?
So,
Well, yeah, go.
nope, it's
I was going
okay.
to say just about everybody here could answer
Yes.
one part of this.
So I'm going to speak to the book specifically. We have the book forum, and that's where you come. You can ask questions specifically about the book. We also have other materials, there's articles and things like that on raywenderlich.com specific to Flutter, iOS, Android, blah, 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 blah. We have a Discord channel that will also, you can post questions and things in there, as well as more forum things that you can use. So for the Ray Wenderlich stuff, there's our Discord server. Before, just a little bit ago, you had the forum. So I'm going to stop there unless Kevin has anything else to answer.
All right.
So-
And Simon, how can people get questions answered through the Flutter community?
So it's flutter.dev/community, and they'll find on there we have Reddit, Discord, Slack, you name it. There's a way of talking to other people to get your questions answered. Yeah, I think there's some statistics we were looking at just earlier. Was that I think there's 16,500 people on the Slack. So I'm sure someone has the answer that you're looking for, or can point you in the right direction to figure out what your answer is that you need. So yeah, there's plenty of help around.
Yeah, it's a great part of the community. And I mean, of course, we've got Stack Overflow, and Sarah was nice enough earlier to show us a slide that had where all the different community groups are. And we've got quite a few things like that.
I should point out that in the YouTube show notes is links to all of the things I put in the slides. So you can just check out.
I was going to say,
that.
Also, you'll find literally, if you have a question, it's a post on Stack Overflow, you probably find that Randall's already answered it, or
Right.
Remy.
Yeah.
The two people that are just literally answering every question on Stack Overflow. Yeah, you'll find.
And it's a great time to say thank you again to Randall for
Yes,
answering
thank
questions.
you,
in our
Randall.
Exactly. Thank you, Randall.
Been a
he does
hero in the
great job.
comments.
And thank you so much for that, Randall. Everything. And
just
I
an
keep threatening to
addition.
bring him up on. I'm sorry.
Just an addition. So as we mentioned in today's stream, there is no basic question, there's no dumb question. You can always put the questions to the questions beginner channel in the Flutter Community Slack workspace. If you think that they are quite easy, so we can just take care of them.
Absolutely, I agree with that. Thank you so much, Esra. All right, and then Sarah, as the kind of the leader of our book club, what should we be doing the next week?
So just before you go, next week we are going to cover networking and serialization. And this is covered in chapters 10 and 11 sort of conceptually. And then in chapter 12, it goes into specifically how you can use the chopper package to do it in practice. And yeah, so if you can, please read it before next week. And if you can't, that's okay. Craig will walk you through it.
And just a little bit of info, Kevin also wrote those chapters.
Yeah, so
Great.
we hope Kevin will
back.
be back next week. I don't know. Kevin, can you come next week?
Yeah, I'll be on.
And I won't be here
Awesome.
next week, everybody. Sorry, but I will leave you in capable hands, and I will see you all in 2 weeks.
All right, great. So thank you, everybody.
All right.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
Thanks, Simon. Take us out.
Bye.